All right, Simon, you dirty vegan. Let's talk glucose, fat loss, continuous glucose monitors, like how managing glucose plays a role in fat loss. We talked a little bit about Roy Taylor and some of his hypothesis. Found it very, very interesting. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
After this video, get 20% off of any Bubs Naturals product. Now, particularly their Halo Creamer. So we're talking just a couple of simple ingredients, nothing hidden in it, no weird nastiness. We're talking MCT oil powder, we're talking grass-fed butter, and they have a vegan formula that doesn't have the grass-fed butter as well, and tapioca starch. So it's filling, it lights your brain up, and it's a good way to start the day, but the taste is unbelievable. There's a lot of creamers that are out there, but this one just has a light fluffiness to it that just tastes unreal. So 20% off whatever you want from Bubs Naturals using code THOMAS20, but definitely check out their Halo Creamer. Now, the cool thing about Bubs Naturals is that 10% of the proceeds go to charity in the name of Glenn Doherty. Now, Glenn Doherty was a Navy SEAL who went by the call sign Bub, which is where the name Bubs Naturals comes from. So the charities are all about helping the families and the relatives, people that are associated with special operations. So when you're looking at the military, you're looking at families that maybe have had family members killed in action, you name it. And Bubs is there to support them. So that's one of the big reasons I stand behind them. What they're doing is amazing. As someone that personally works with special forces and special operations myself, it's very near and dear to me. So again, 20% off whatever you get through Bubs, and know that 10% of those proceeds are going to an awesome cause.
Right, so Roy Taylor is a researcher based in the UK, and he has a hypothesis. I believe now many would say he's proven it, but it's called the twin cycle hypothesis. And really, it's a way of explaining how insulin resistance develops, and then ultimately how someone would end up with type 2 diabetes. Pre-diabetes, then type 2 diabetes typically. And I guess at the center of this model is excess energy or energy toxicity. So the twin cycle hypothesis relies upon someone eating more energy or calories than their body is utilizing. So they're in what we'd call a calorie surplus. And Roy Taylor came up with what's called the personal fat threshold. So some people have a better capability of storing excess energy in subcutaneous fat depots than other people. These other people that have less capability of storing fat subcutaneously will have fat spilling over earlier at a given body weight, given BMI, into visceral fat. And what is visceral fat? So essentially that is fat in organs, particularly the liver and the pancreas, but also can be found in muscle tissue, for example. And all of this can contribute to insulin resistance. Another way of describing that fat that some people may have heard of is ectopic fat, which just means fat in the wrong place. Okay, so essentially this also explains why you can have someone with obesity that does not develop type 2 diabetes, whereas the next person with obesity at the same body weight does develop type 2 diabetes. And so what happens is, as fat accumulates, usually initially in the liver, you develop hepatic insulin resistance. And there's a good analogy actually to think about how our body controls blood sugar. We can think of a bathtub. I often think about this. So if you imagine the faucet or the spout at the top, which you twist to allow water to flow into the bath, we can imagine that faucet is your liver, okay? And the water coming into the bathtub is blood sugar going into your blood, right? And then at the bottom of the bathtub, you have the drain. We can imagine that is like our muscle tissue, okay? So one of our liver's primary jobs is actually to produce glucose and dumps that into the bloodstream, and that allows us to maintain blood sugar homeostasis, okay? And insulin acts on the liver to turn off that tap. So insulin at the liver actually slows down the release of sugar going into the blood, Okay, so when we say someone has become insulin resistant in the liver, which is what happens when you get a buildup of fat in the liver tissue, they now have an inability to turn off that tap. So they have more sugar flowing into circulation. Someone could also have insulin resistance, as I mentioned, in muscle tissue, if they're storing excess fat within muscle cells. And within this analogy, you can sort of, I said, you can think about muscle as the drain. So in that scenario, someone has insulin resistance in the liver, they can't turn off the tap. They have insulin resistance in the muscle tissue, so they can't unblock the drain. What's happening? Well, now we've got water building up, or in the case of our body, blood sugar. Okay. Now, when someone starts storing fat in their liver, initially that's the primary sort of site of visceral fat. But over time, they'll begin to develop fat in the pancreas as well. And the pancreas, of course, is where our body produces insulin in the beta cells. And as more and more fat accumulates in the pancreas, your beta cells become less and less able to produce insulin. So you have this sort of compounding effect where your liver is pouring more glucose into the bloodstream, and your pancreas is starting to become overwhelmed and is less and less able to produce insulin. And the net effect of that is rising of blood glucose, to the point where someone ends up being diagnosed with type 2 diabetes. So that's Roy Taylor's kind of twin cycle hypothesis, is that this insulin resistance and elevation of blood sugar starts off with hepatic fat primarily, so in the liver, and then goes into the pancreas until someone has sort of beta cell dysfunction and ends up with a blood sugar level that we would say they have type 2 diabetes. Now, at the start, I mentioned the personal fat threshold. So to tie all of this together, close the loop on that, some people are just more predisposed genetically to store more visceral fat, right? Which again is why you can have two people who are the same body weight, but one person has more insulin resistance, or one person gets type 2 diabetes and the other doesn't.
So does the personal fat threshold potentially dictate the actual amount of fat mass someone can carry, or is it the threshold in just which an adipocyte can take in glucose?
That's an interesting question. So you're asking whether, can you reframe that question for me?
Well, so in essence, is there potentially, or is he hypothesizing there's actually a limit to how much fat someone can gain as well? Like if it's an energy storage issue, obviously an adipocyte grows in multiple fashions, but one of which is through de novo lipogenesis. So if we have a personal fat threshold, do we reach a point at which we no longer really gain, those fat cells don't really swell anymore, and everything just gets rejected into glucose? And that's why you might have someone that eats a lot of calories but is 450 pounds and morbidly obese versus someone that eats a similar amount of calories and might be 350 pounds and obese. It's kind of an odd question, but it makes me wonder if like the ability to sort of reject a fuel and transfer it over into visceral fat can actually dictate how much fat mass someone carries as well.
It's an interesting question, because can someone store unlimited amounts of fat viscerally once the subcutaneous fat depot has sort of tapped out? I would think no. I think ultimately their metabolic health would deteriorate so much that they just would reach a point where their body's no longer functioning.
Yeah. And that's what's, interesting is, obviously the fat cell sort of hypertrophy versus potential hyperplasia, which doesn't really, I don't know if it really exists or not. I know it's still under kind of investigation, like fat cells multiplying versus enlarging. It's very interesting. So in essence, we have seen in various bodies of literature that visceral fat is a huge problem when it comes down to insulin resistance. Can you tell us why? I mean, I know there's the inflammatory piece. Are there other pieces outside of just the inflammation?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I'm not sure I know the answer to that. I know that through Roy's work and listening to Roy speak, that just having excess fat stored in liver cells causes insulin resistance within the liver. The precise mechanisms of which, whether is that driven through inflammation or other mechanisms, I'm not sure that anyone fully understands that. I think all that we're kind of working out is the big picture stuff. When there's too much of fat in the liver, and it's over 6% when it becomes an issue. So once someone has more than 6% fat in the liver, that's when they start developing enough insulin resistance for it to be having this knock-on effect on the pancreas.
Wow, that doesn't sound like that much. I mean, it doesn't sound like it's 6%. I mean, it doesn't sound like it takes that much to put yourself there.
I think 25% of the adult population in America have non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, which means...
Is that diagnosed or just...
By definition, that would mean they have over 6% fat in their liver.
Wow. Well, this is interesting though, because not everyone understands insulin resistance at that level. We'll understand it, at a muscle cell level where there's resistance there. And people don't always understand that, there's varying degrees of insulin resistance happening at different levels, right? Insulin resistance can come to be by the lack of expression of beta cells. You're no longer producing producing beta cells, right? There's that way. There's the muscle cells becoming glucose intolerant. That's a way. And then obviously when you rope a lot of these together, or the inability for the glucose or the liver to turn off the spilling of glucose is another way. And there's other ways too, right? There's also the inflammatory response, when there's inflammation just impeding that insulin signal. And all of these are causative in time to lead to this overarching type 2 diabetes, where essentially you've got almost all of it. Not by definition, but if you look at people with type 2 diabetes, they have almost all these things going on. And I think the definition for the diagnosis of type 2 diabetes is pretty loose when we know there's different mechanisms. But I guess what I'm getting at is the liver is a big piece of this. And people don't often understand that it's not just the excess carbohydrates that potentially cause this problem. So I want to transition into an area that's tender territory for people, and that's the aspect of how lipids can actually affect our liver. So we've established that liver fat is a major contributor to insulin resistance. Well, what are some ways that we end up with that 6% or more?
Right. Yeah, I would go as far as to say that when it comes to insulin resistance or metabolic health, the liver is the master regulator of this piece. And the pancreas is important, muscle insulin sensitivity is important, but that insulin resistance at the liver seems to be the primary piece of this whole metabolic health puzzle. What causes an increase in hepatic fat and the development of insulin resistance at the liver? The inability to turn off that tap. I think firstly, energy toxicity. It's a diet that's providing an excess of energy, no matter what diet that is. And I think most people in the research world that are looking at non-alcoholic fatty liver disease or type 2 diabetes would agree on that. Before coming down and thinking about the constituents in the diet, whether it's carbs or saturated fat or unsaturated fats, etc. So I think let's flag that. That's the number one factor. And when it comes to lipids, the research that I've seen, and I've discussed this on my show with Richard Johnson, Dr. Richard Johnson, who is a researcher looking at fructose and how that affects the liver. There's a suite of trials that have looked at comparing simple sugars with unsaturated fats, with saturated fats, in different scenarios. So some of these feeding trials are looking at hypercaloric conditions, some are hypocaloric, so a calorie deficit, and some are eucaloric, we're at weight, sort of energy balance. And what's really interesting is that in a hypercaloric state, as you may guess, all of these different whether it's simple sugars or unsaturated fats or saturated fats can drive hepatic fat, right? But to different degrees. So simple sugars and saturated fat seem to be much more deleterious than unsaturated fats, even in a hypercaloric state. In a hypercaloric state, there are studies comparing fructose to glucose, and I know fructose, a lot of people hate fructose, but both seem to be equally bad if you're in a hypercaloric state when it comes to hepatic fat. When you're at energy balance, the simple sugars don't really seem to be driving hepatic fat, which I found really interesting, because I thought that the refined sugars, even at a energy balance, may still drive some hepatic fat increase in insulin resistance, but we don't see that. But interestingly, even at energy balance, you do see saturated fats will increase the amount of hepatic fat, which I think is potentially a bit of a bitter pill, maybe for some people to swallow. I'm not sort of demonizing saturated fat to the point where I'm saying that it can't exist in the diet, but I think if someone has visceral fat, is insulin resistant, is trying to improve their metabolic health, one is getting to an ideal body weight. And so the ideal body weight for each person is going to be different because it depends on that personal fat threshold. But getting to the point where you have less visceral fat and you get the liver fat down below 6% is going to be, that's really important. And it's going to be primarily driven by weight loss. And then secondly, when you're looking at the type of nutrients in your diet, I think there is merit to the inclusion or having a bias towards more unsaturated fats over saturated. And same thing with carbohydrates. I still think it's good to have a bias for the unrefined, minimally processed sources of carbohydrates over the refined simple sugars.
Yes. And when we look at insulin resistance, high glucose, and we're wanting to lower glucose, people's first inclination is to reduce their carbohydrate intake or reduce their sugar intake. Do you think there's bigger levers to pull for someone that is just trying to control their glucose? Because obviously there's many ways to skin this cat, right? Like there's a low carb diet clearly works. Exercise clearly works. Even people on a plant-based diet, it definitely works. Low saturated fats, it clearly works. As long as the energy balance piece is there. But independent of that, if we're looking at this liver being a huge epicenter for this problem, it almost makes me wonder if, is reducing the glucose the bigger lever to pull, or is potentially reducing saturated fats alongside calorically restricting, no matter which means you try to get there, to try to reduce that intrahepatic fat. I mean, that sounds like that might be one of the bigger levers that we can pull, no matter which way you try to get there.
I mean, ultimately, what are we trying to do here? We're trying to get the fat that's in the wrong place out of there, right? We want less fat in the muscle cells. We want less fat in the pancreas and less fat in the liver. And I think you just summarized the levers that people need to think about. One is, and this kind of goes back to an earlier conversation we had before on my podcast, is people need to find the type of diet that feels easiest for them, that allows them to lose weight in a way that's sustainable and they can keep the weight off. And for some people, that could be more of a low carb approach. For other people, that could be a high carb. Whichever direction you're going, you need to think about diet quality. What are the quality of the carbohydrates and the fats you're consuming? If someone's choosing low carb and that works for them to lose weight, I think that's a fantastic option. But like you said, I would then be thinking about, okay, well, within that theme of low carb, I'm also going to moderate the amount of saturated fats, have a bias for unsaturated fats. And in the same thing could be said about someone who chooses high carb, plant-based or whatever it is. Within that context, what type of carbohydrates are you choosing? Are these going to be carbohydrates that are full of fiber and polyphenols and compounds we know that increase satiety and help you with the weight loss? Or is it going to be the more indulgent, seductive foods that have carbohydrates that make weight loss very hard and probably are going to sabotage your efforts of getting this fat out of these locations that we just spoke about?
So, I'm wondering if reducing glucose spikes has a tremendous advantage, or a tremendous effect, I should say, on reducing that liver fat. I know that reducing carbohydrate intake simply by reducing energy can reduce the visceral fat and reduce this, the fat within the liver. I wonder how much spikes in glucose impact this as well. If you take a perfectly healthy person that is not insulin resistant and you chronically keep spiking their glucose over and over again inside of energy balance at eucaloric, I would imagine at some point you're going to have a degree of de novo lipogenesis that's going to occur in the acute setting, right? So if I were to spike to 200 6 times per day for 15 minutes each time, and I was eating at exact eucaloric value, this is purely hypothetical. We're just kind of spitballing here. There's got to be some effect that's happening, whether it's visceral fat or spillover into just straight up de novo lipogenesis into sub-Q fat. And the reason I position this is because I know this is the constant question that people have. It's like, okay, if I'm at energy balance, what's worse for me?
There's an interesting paper, and this takes us back to, I think, the 1970s. So excuse me if I can't remember all the details of this paper, but we're really digging into the history books here. So it's a paper by Jenkins. This paper I'm thinking of is Anderson. And I find this to be an interesting paper because they look at people with type 2 diabetes, and they wanted to see whether they could get people off medications and into quote unquote remission, which I think is a term that's kind of still up for debate, or at least reversing type 2 diabetes is, in a diet that was not hypocaloric. It was actually at weight maintenance. So these people were not losing weight. And they used a high carbohydrate vegetarian diet in that study and got remarkable results. So I'm more of the view that I'm not concerned about carbohydrates. I'm concerned about the quality of the carbohydrates. And if you look at, like, there's a couple of guys I know who have a program called Mastering Diabetes, and they have people on these very high carbohydrate diets, but they're very low in saturated fat, super low in saturated fat, and there's no refined, simple sugars, ultra processed foods in there. And people have remarkable blood glucose management. So I think that you can go either way. Probably being stuck in the middle is a little bit like no man's land to a degree, particularly if you have lots of saturated fat and carbs in the diet. That's probably the worst place that someone with type 2 diabetes could end up. I think they're better off choosing more of the extreme. So it's either going super low carb or super low fat. And I think all of this is borne out in the data when you look at these low carb versus low fat weight loss trials. And there was recently another big meta-analysis looking at weight loss, low fat versus low carb in people with type 2 diabetes. And by 2 years, we don't see any difference. So I kind of sound like a bit of a broken record, but I think the personalization piece here is critical. What is going to be the diet that you can follow that allows you to be in a sustained calorie deficit to get to an ideal body weight for you? That means that your essentially your energy that your body requires is tapping into the visceral fat to get that energy, getting you down below 6% fat in the liver. And in Roy Taylor's work, we see that it's probably 10 to 15% of your body weight that most people on average need to lose if they have type 2 diabetes to get into remission. And that is a little bit dependent on how long you've had it. So in their studies where people have only had type 2 diabetes for 4 years or less, they have much better results in terms of chance of remission than if someone's had it for 10 or 20 years and their pancreas is just super burnt out. They just can't get the restoration of the beta cell function. Whereas someone who's had it for a much shorter period of time can actually get restoration of beta cell function if they get the fat out of the pancreas and the liver. So I guess that's just a bit of an exclamation point on, if we have insulin resistance, we want to act early on this. And be thinking about how visceral fat, you can measure that crudely through waist circumference, which is probably why that's a big part of the metabolic syndrome kind of cluster of things that are measured. And creating the strategy using the tools that work best for you, whether that's time restricted eating or choosing a particular macronutrient, to help you get into that calorie deficit. And then just thinking about food quality, lots of fiber, having a bias for unsaturated fats. And, we'll see people get, I think, good results using quite a range of those tools.
You mentioned something super important. That's the degree of which your insulin resistance is, the degree or how long you've had type 2 diabetes too, because coming back to these different aspects of it, complete pancreatic beta cell burnout, right? Versus insulin resistant muscle cells and poor GLUT4 translocation. And you look at mitochondrial health, and I know there's a lot of bodies of work looking at this where, okay, with mitochondrial health, if you have dysfunctional mitochondria, potentially by putting yourself into a ketogenic state, you provide an alternative fuel source for these mitochondria to potentially regain function, right? I know we see this in the mental side of things. We see this in the brain where beta hydroxybutyrate or some of these even acetate, which alcohol can convert into, can actually provide dysfunctional mitochondria that were normally starved of glucose with a fuel, allowing those mitochondria to sort of rekindle life and actually, I don't want to say regenerate, but come back to life. So it's interesting because I just think there's multiple ways to go about this, right? And there's people that aren't in a very late stage level of insulin resistance. My hypothesis is that they might benefit more, or not even more. They might be the ones that could see a quick result with a low carb because maybe their level of insulin resistance hasn't gotten so extreme where they have complete dysfunction of their pancreatic beta cells, but they're able to restore mitochondrial function sort of at the external level, sort of at the muscle level. And if you can restore that, then maybe you can catch it early before it starts to become even more problematic. Whereas as the pathology gets worse and as someone develops further insulin resistance and diabetes, then it becomes much more of an actual organ problem where reducing those fats become much more important. Those saturated fats become, this is purely hypothetical here, but I'm trying to think of the two sides because I think those are the two worlds that don't communicate as much, at least in the world of people like you and I that think about this stuff. It's like, okay, well, what are these different attributes of type 2 diabetes? The
other, I guess, potential pro for a low carb approach here for some people is from a motivation point of view. A low carb diet, even though I said before 2 years like weight loss, on the aggregate is pretty even.
Yeah.
And I just want to be clear because some people listening will be like, no, well, I've adopted, I've tried both and low carb worked much better. Within those studies, even though it's on the aggregate, there are people in each. Some people do better on the low carb, some people do better on low fat. So I don't want to kind of gloss over that. But one thing that we do see is in the first 6 months, a low carb diet typically outperforms a low fat diet by a little bit in terms of weight. And that could be some water weight. I think that initially when you adopt that low carb diet, you probably lose a bit more weight in the first few weeks. And that can be quite motivating, seeing that scale weight. So for some people, if we're talking about trying to get them onto a program that they can sustain, that I can see how that can actually be a motivating factor for many people.
Yeah, there's also, I have a theory as to why that is. And it's been somewhat vetted out in other mechanistic data. When you first go on a very low carb diet, it's a massive inefficiency. And so your resting energy expenditure goes up. So whereas if you've taken someone that's been eating carbs their entire life and you just restrict fat but the carbohydrates stay the same, you're not really developing any inefficiency. Whereas when you deprive carbohydrates, for lack of a better term, it's a little bit more of a shock and you have to increase, the body basically has a high degree of reactive oxygen species that happens when people first start a low carb. Sounds terrible, but that is where the hormetic stressor effect of, say, a ketogenic diet comes in, is there's actually a hormetic stressor that actually allows you to become a little bit more resilient against those specific ROS. So with that, they see an increase in resting energy expenditure. And that is very, very much so pronounced in the beginning. The low carb community will sometimes take that and run with it. Say, well, this is great because low carb is going to increase my REE. That's great. That does not continue forever. And I think that's very important to understand. And exactly as you noted, is it does net out eventually. And then it comes down to what works for you. But that is my theory as to why is that there is this moderate increase in REE, resting energy expenditure. So when you take that in someone that is also very inactive, That's a big delta. That's a big thing for them to gain X amount of resting energy expenditure without really changing their lifestyle. Not to mention, when most people do go on a diet, they probably are changing their exercise habits as well. That's pretty common. A lot of times people, they just do both. Right. So it's hard to operationalize that a little bit. But then you have an increase in REE plus potential activity at that heightened resting energy expenditure. It nets out to quite a bit more burn. And then when that balances out, then you're just left with what works for you.
Yeah. And one thing I left out from Roy Taylor's work that if he was listening to this, he might be a bit cross. So let me add it in there, is they, in the direct trial, and people can look this up. So if you said to me, hey, imagine today you're diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, like what would I do? What behavior change or what protocols would I adopt? In their study, they actually use a very highly restricted, calorie restricted diet for 8 to 12 weeks as a very specific intervention. It's about 800 calories a day, so super low. And they use meal replacement shakes for this. And kind of at face value, that sounds crazy, but the results are pretty incredible. So they get people to commit to do this very intensive. It's an intervention, but they're not asking people to do this forever. 800 calories a day. And on average, most people lose 10 to 15 kilograms over that period. And then they go through this transition approach to shift them to whichever kind of diet, and a lot of discussion around what we've just been speaking, they can adopt and bump their calories back up to more towards weight maintenance and then try and keep that weight off long term. I think that if I had type 2 diabetes and I needed to lose a lot of weight, I actually think for me personally, that's what I would do. I would commit to that and lose a large chunk of weight very quickly. And then I would shift to something that's more sustainable.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I think that, and there's newer research, this is pretty fascinating, that's showing that, losing weight fast is not any worse or better than losing weight slow. So what you can do to lose weight fast is actually great. You just have to factor in, of course, your lean body mass. If you lose weight too fast, you run that risk. And that kind of brings up that simple thing is like, okay, if you can reduce that mass and get yourself into a healthy state faster, let's say you've got 5 years left to live and you spend 3 years of that trying to get the weight off, then you only have a 2-year delta of being at a healthy weight to elicit its positive effects upon your body. But if you lose that weight in a year, then you have 4 years to reap the positive benefits of being at that new, healthier set point. So in a lot of ways, just losing the weight fast and letting your body kind of do the rest is very effective as long as you're factoring in your lean body mass and looking forward too. So I think that that's sometimes wrongfully demonized, people that lose weight fast. I lost weight fast and I kept it off. And if I took longer to lose that weight, that would have meant that I have a longer period of time under the reign of my adipose tissue,
I think that was the prevailing kind of view. That was, I certainly thought it was better to lose weight slower. But then having read this research, the UK has actually now approved that intervention using that 800 calorie diet as something that can be prescribed to people with type 2 diabetes.
Wow.
Which is super interesting. And I've got a question for you because you were speaking of exercise there. That research group recommended not to start exercise during that very calorie restricted period. And I wonder what you think about this. Their rationale for that was that sometimes when you add exercise at the same time as trying to do significant calorie restriction, the exercise can drive hunger. So their advice was to do the 8 to 12 weeks of calorie restriction without adding a significant amount of new exercise or anything. And then after that period, then introducing an exercise protocol to help prevent weight regain.
Yeah, I can't say I would necessarily do it different because they have a very solid point. Yes, it does drive up hunger. I think cardio work tends to drive up hunger more than resistance training. So maybe they could probably have gotten away with a couple days resistance training just to maintain mass.
I think I think I tend to agree with that, particularly if you're in that big calorie deficit, and if you're someone who's 50 or 60, you really don't. You want to preserve lean mass.
Yeah.
And the biggest way of doing that, the greatest stimulus, is lifting weights.
Yeah, and that's what people forget. They forget that
training.
Yeah, they forget that that is the biggest driver, is the stimulus. Second to that, the protein. But it's I've done a lot of experiments on myself where I'm in 2, 3, 4 day fasts multiple times, and I just make sure that I resistance train because my theory on it, at least, is the body's going to try its best to maintain what it thinks is relevant. And if I'm using that muscle, my body's going to say, well, this is relevant. He's using this. I'm not just going to willy-nilly get rid of it. Yeah. That wouldn't make sense from a survival aspect, would it? It's just, but if we're not using it, then the body's saying, well, shoot, this is metabolically expensive to carry, and this is not using it. So go ahead and get rid of it, right? And I think that it sets a dovetail into such an important overarching piece of this that we can probably wrap up with, because I'm sure people think, okay, what's the takeaway here? I mean, no matter what stage of insulin resistance you could be in, movement, that insulin independent glucose uptake, you can suck up glucose into a muscle cell without insulin even being needed by moving your body. And whatever means of dieting or whatever you want to call it gets you to a point where you feel like you can be more active, not just get the weight off, is probably the biggest piece. And some people, if you cut carbs out of their diet, they just have no impetus to work out. And that right, wrong, left, right, it doesn't matter. It's just how they're wired. My wife's kind of that way when she first cut out
I'm
carbs.
that way.
Yeah.
I need some carbs.
Yeah. She just likes to have some carbs before she works out. She's just like, I can't do it. I just can't do it. And she's my own wife. What am I going to divorce her because of that? It's so whatever gets her active is what I'm all for. So I think that's such like a big overarching piece is, independent of just saying, hey, do whatever diet helps you lose weight. I second that with do whatever diet encourages you to be active.
Yeah. And just taking a sort of zooming out even further from this is remembering that weight loss it's a lot more than just selecting the right foods and the right macronutrient ratio for you, but it's how are you managing your relationships and your stress in your life? How are you thinking about your sleep? We spoke earlier, I think, about sleep deprivation and how that affects hunger. This is not just speculation. There are clinical trials showing that. So I think it's about taking a look at your entire lifestyle, not necessarily having all the focus on food. I totally agree. And exercise is particularly powerful.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And if I had to say my top 5, I'd say I keep my saturated fat under 20% of my total fat calories. I make it a mission to move my body every day, whether it's resistance training or not. Personally, I like to earn my carbs. And what I mean by that is not from some weird body dysmorphia type thing. I do throttle my carbohydrate intake based upon my activity because I look at it like that. It's like if I'm going to be very sedentary, I don't think I want to take in as much carbs. And that's worked really, really well for me. The other piece, I increase my monounsaturated fats tremendously in place of those saturated fats because not all fats are created equal. And, if we were to look gram for gram, like there very huge benefits to monounsaturated fats. There are to polyunsaturated fats too, but the monounsaturated fats are very strong, and the literature is quite strong, especially with like palmitoleic omega-7 from macadamia nuts and things like that. Just cool stuff that we're seeing, And then if I had to sort of pick, one more thing that I would suggest, I think that's the one that kind of gets forgotten in this whole category is the protein equation. People focus so much on the fats, the carbs, but they forget that the thermic effect of protein and the ability to maintain that massive glucose sink that we talked about. So, that's my 5. I don't know if you have 5 you want to wrap up with too.
I mean, we have a lot of overlap, I think it sounds like you think about your carbohydrates for performance.
Yes.
Which I would agree. I tend to also think about carbohydrates for performance and replenishing glycogen stores, and tend to have most of my carbohydrates after a workout. But I also think about carbohydrates as many of the foods that are providing really important different types of fiber. different types of prebiotic fiber that feed different strains of bacteria and help increase short chain fatty acids, which can affect hunger, GLP-1 levels and PYY levels, a bunch of stuff. So fiber, I think about fiber from a diverse range of plants, protein, making sure that you're getting enough. And I think the more plant-based you are, the more you probably need to focus on that a little bit more. The point that you made earlier about the biggest stimulus being resistance training, there's a recent systematic review and meta-analysis looking specifically, this was at strength, not hypertrophy, but it was looking at different protein intakes and strength in two conditions. One is people that don't do any resistance training, and one is in the context of people that do resistance training. And in the context of not doing resistance training, going from 0.8 grams per kilogram to say 1.5 makes bugger all difference when it comes to strength. Now we could argue that, okay, well, there might be some other benefits of having more protein in the diet for satiety or, different bodily functions that require amino acids. But then when you look in the resistance training context, you just see, firstly, at all protein intakes, even at 0.8 grams, massively increased strength compared to the context where there's no resistance training stimulus. So the most notable thing is that the resistance training piece is absolutely critical. And then when you look at, say, 1.3 grams of protein per kilo to 1.5, not a huge amount of difference, but at 1.5, 1.6 grams, that is where you see the sort of the optimal level if you're trying to maximize for strength. So I think about fiber, I think about protein, but I make sure that resistance training stimulus is there to help maintain lean mass. Fats, I have a very similar approach to you. You're always going to have some saturated fats in the diet. It's impossible to have a 0 gram saturated fat diet. So saturated fat's not poison, but the dose seems to matter quite a bit if we're thinking about whether it is hepatic fat or we're thinking about ApoB levels. And that's going to, again, vary a little bit from person to person based on their genes. So some people can get away with a bit more saturated fat than the next person. And really the only way of knowing that is to eat a particular diet, be aware of the foods that you're eating, and do a blood test and have a look, and sort of titrate from there. If your ApoB level is good for you, whatever your overall risk profile is, then you don't need to make any changes to saturated fat in your diet. But if it's high, you might want to look at swapping some of the saturated fat rich foods out and eating more unsaturated fat rich foods and eating more fiber, for example. So I have this bias for unsaturated fats, olive oil and avocados and nuts and seeds and tofu, those sorts of foods, as opposed to coconut oil and palm oil, which would be the two kind of plant-based sources or very, very rich sources of saturated fat that can catch some plant-based folks off guard. Yeah. When they think, well, I'm just eating plants, my blood lipids should be perfect. But if you're dumping a lot of palm oil or coconut oil, you can see your ApoB go up quite a lot. So those are kind of the main things that I'm thinking about, and then trying to optimize sleep and stress and relationships.
Yeah, absolutely, man. Well, Simon, where can everyone find you, man?
So Instagram at Simon Hill. Twitter is at The Proof. And then I have a podcast, which is The Proof. You can search that on YouTube or Apple, Spotify. And then on my website, I have blogs and links to everything, which is theproof.com.
Perfect. Right on. As always, see y'all tomorrow.
Thanks, Thomas.